And the surprising thing is 68% of enterprise companies say they've adopted agentic AI. So the vast majority have adopted this.
New Relic, they were seeing like I think it was 30% month on month growth of these agents going into production.
Morning, Sam. How are you?
Morning, Matt. I'm good. Congratulations on the event last week. It was really awesome.
Yes, we're talking about VentureBeat Transform, which happens every summer. It's really focused on the enterprise companies that are actually doing real things, deploying AI. What are the lessons that these decision makers, right? But the audience or the peers, the enterprise folks coming to learn how to build AI. And Sam, it was your first event. What did you think?
Definitely was really interesting event. I gotta say, congratulations on the quality of the people that you had, on stage and stuff like that. I think it was really interesting to see not just sort of tech people from sort of the San Francisco Bay Area, but also like CTOs from big companies like American Express, like a bunch of healthcare companies. I and for me, that was probably the most interesting part was seeing what they were interested in, seeing what how they were starting to look at agents, how they're looking at this whole AI roadmap of where things are going. I I think like it's rare that you get that many people on stage with that kind of experience to actually talk about these things. So that's what one of the big reasons I said congratulations was just that for me that was in many ways a lot more interesting than some of the events that we've covered in the past for the big companies where they're hyping up their products or that stuff. This was more like, okay, looking at their customers and seeing, okay, what is it that they actually want to do?
Sam, that was the whole intent, right? Let's cut through the noise. There's a lot of events, from the big hyperscalers that have all the glossy, nice stories to tell. But this is, independent place, and we had 65 speakers just really focused on these case studies. So, let's go through those lessons. I think the big first point is that agents are actually going into production. Again, we're not into hype here, but a VentureBeat's AI survey, which we do every year, right, running into the event, we asked 2,000 folks from our audience, and we collated according to who was, we actually got data from them who are actually enterprise respondents for companies working at 1,000 employees or more. And we asked them, had they adopted agentic AI? And the surprising thing is 68% of enterprise companies say they've adopted agentic AI. So the vast majority have adopted this. Now I got to, disclose that, VentureBeat's readership is a little different from, say, KPMG, right, which did a similar survey in June and found that only 11% of their enterprise companies surveyed are in deployment. So there is a big difference depending on your base here. But the fact that of those 67%, even of those, the biggest number were actually in advanced stages of that deployment. In other words, external facing applications instead of just agentic applications that were internal, where you can sandbox things a little bit more. I thought that was interesting. But boy, our team is tired, Sam, right? I think we've got like 40 stories already on our site, kind of with these case studies. If everyone wants to read and has like 5 hours to go through it, but cases like Intuit, Capital One, LinkedIn, Highmark Health, right, or case all companies that have actually instituted this agentic stuff. Did anything stand out for you?
Yeah, definitely. There are a couple of really interesting things. So one of the early speakers was from BCG, who was talking about he talked about very nice talk about where sort of agents were, where they were going. One of the interesting things he said was that it was too early to sort of see in P&L statements like the effect of these things, like were they actually being deployed. But then later that day, I interviewed Ashan, the CEO of New Relic, and so for those people who don't know, they basically are a monitoring company. So they really just monitor things in production. And they were seeing like I think it was 30% month on month growth of these agents going into production. So while we may be a little bit early to see, the sort of monetary effects of these things, we clearly are seeing that lots of companies are putting these things into production. And for me, that was like really fascinating conversation talking with Ashan, of just sort of what they were seeing, and then also what they were doing themselves. I But these themes came up, both later that day and the next day. Like you said, we had lots of people talking about that they were starting to put things, uh, you know, not just internal tools, but customer facing stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, we could go into some of these end user big brands, like you said, Intuit, Amex, and Highmark Health, details. But there's good examples even from the big LLM provider companies that were at the event as well, right? Scott White from Anthropic. Yes, he's a provider. Yes, there's an incentive to talk about how great these solutions are, but it was really a genuine conversation with this guy, relatively early in his career, not a professional programmer, but talking about how, excited he was building production ready software features himself, right? Building a workable prototype on his staging server and then showing his team internally how it works, right? This wasn't possible 6 months ago. Just using Claude code, which again, many people are. And I thought that was interesting. And similarly, we had OpenAI's head of product, Olivier Godement, right, who's responsible for the API platform, but talked about how they built their responses API, their agents SDK to help these multi-agent systems. You and I have been talking about this. We've been reporting about it, but customers like Stripe and Box are using these frameworks and actually implementing these things for real as well.
It certainly was interesting. Even I think the event kicked off with Varun from Windsurf, and both him and others did talk about that. They need to be thinking for the future of where people who are making apps, who are making, are the sort of the makers in a company, are not necessarily going to be coders. They're going to be people with ideas, with sort of a clarity of what they want, and then being able to run that out. Even Ashan from New Relic talked about that they are starting to think about how do they create observability tools for those people to help those people see sort of what's working, what's not working. So yeah, that was definitely a theme. I don't think we were really surprised by that. Like that's something that we talked about, going back to even when we started last year, that Microsoft was trying to put a lot of this stuff into Copilot, really because a lot of the people using it were not coders, right? This is the whole idea of these agent builder apps. But yeah, it is very interesting to have both sort of frontier labs like OpenAI, like Anthropic, talk about this stuff, and see where they're seeing things going, as well as their customers like Windsurf and where they're seeing it going as well.
I want to come back to the Mohan talk of what the Windsurf CEO. I don't know point number four, but let's go to point number two, right? Which is that there's no real winners among the hyperscalers in the sense of model dominance, right? And across the event, we heard that just like everyone wants to support every single model, that there's more infrastructure being built by the day to allow this to happen, right? I thought, IBM's gateway, right, which is taking things to the next level, like a single API that allows any company to take any model to work into their infrastructure. I thought that was really interesting. We've heard of these efforts before, and this is not a new story that people are using multiple LLMs, small LLMs, customized, fine-tuned LLMs all over the place, but it just hit home that like there's no real winner.
It certainly did, and that was the person that I ended up doing a fireside chat on day two with, was Aman Ruiz, who's at IBM, working on AI there, been there for a long time. It was fascinating sort of hearing him talk about that. Yeah, the model gateway thing wasn't something like, oh yeah, we need to build this. That was in reaction to customers, and that was in reaction to initially, IBM looking at doing their own models, then realizing, oh well, we should support open source because everyone wants open source. Then realizing that but also people want the proprietary models. In the end, they realized that they had to support everything, and I thought that was fascinating of like how there was a progression there of getting to that. That wasn't sort of like a decision made by them. That was in reaction to customers. Another really interesting one was the CTO of Zoom, talking about how they were having to sort of do. I sort of took it away as like three levels of models of where one, they've got proprietary models that they're supporting if people want to use those. Two, they've got the Zoom model, which is their model that's sort of trained, specific for the kinds of conversations, I guess, in Zoom. And then that doesn't leak any model, that doesn't leak any data outside of Zoom. But then they also allow customers to be able to take that and fine tune a version of that just for their organization. And that model is like, can't be used by anyone else outside of, their org. So that for me was fantastic. And really interesting of how they've got this sort of three levels or these three tiers that they're supporting. I and it seems that customers want that. That's the interesting thing, is that customers are not falling into just a one size fits all. They're not going for OpenAI. Like perhaps this time last year, that's probably what most of the customers were trying to do. I think we've seen it, radically change now. And yeah, the clear, lesson from this is there aren't any winners at the moment when it comes to models. Some people like Anthropic, some people like Gemini, some people, like the OpenAI ones. Some people are liking the whole, open weights models and where that's going. So this is definitely going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Going back to the hyperscaler conversation, Sam, there was a conversation between Dylan Patel, who's one of the leading analysts out there on hardware and how some of these chip providers, right? Sort of NVIDIA, Cerebras, Grok are stacking up, and so we had the co-founder of Cerebras. We had Grok's CEO Jonathan Ross. I think you listened to that session. Any takeaways there on like which hyperscaler is winning and what the dynamics are there?
So one of the fascinating takeaways around that for me was not so much about the hyperscalers. It was more about the customers of the hyperscalers, the ones that we're seeing like the menaces of the world, some of these automated assistants. How that really they're not making much profit because they're just buying so many tokens, and then every time the token cost goes down, that doesn't become suddenly their profit margin. They just buy more tokens in trying to get their products to be better, to be, have higher levels of accuracy. That I found fascinating because at some point, we've got so much VC money flowing around in these companies now. At some point, the VCs want to see a return. And to get that return, these companies are going to have to use less tokens. So they either need better models, which maybe are coming, over the next few months from the rumors that we hear here, or they have to get the current models for a lot cheaper, and then not just sort of use more tokens. I thought that was a fascinating takeaway.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot there we could dive into. I want to keep moving to the third point, which is that now, it feels to me, and I think this is kind of like the unspoken truth of Silicon Valley, right? Is Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, Sam Altman of OpenAI, right? Dario from Anthropic. They're all talking about the super intelligence is nigh, right? They've Meta has just been scrambling to get these super smart researchers, and I think poaching 8 people over the last 2 weeks from OpenAI, a big kind of, big conversational vision conversation here around AGI. But it was like that world is is tired, right, to the real practitioners who don't really, they're not really listening to that. They're really focused on solutions. We don't care about come on. Super intelligence is not nigh. That's kind of like a hype story to hire really good people. And we get why you're doing it. Go ahead and do that. We're focused on real solutions, right? And that seemed to come up in subtle ways.
I
Um,
Yeah, the way I would put it, it, I had a fascinating conversation with Hillary, the CTO from American Express, and I and I won't go into details too much, but the sort of key takeaway from her conversation, as well as multiple others like this over the 2 days, was that it's not necessarily that people, feel that like, okay, AGI, there's no way AGI is coming or that kind of thing. Okay, for me, the general consensus seems to be maybe, maybe not, right? But everyone's sort of looking at these LLMs as being a tool and being a really useful tool that you can use to do lots of different things. And so, really, what they're focused on is how do we use the current technology to get value out of it for both our internally for our making our employees better, and then also for doing things for customers, making things easier for customers. And I think that's the sort of fascination. You're totally right that in the Bay Area, everyone gets caught up in the whole sort of AGI hype, the sort of politics of who's fighting which frontier model is company is fighting the other one at this week, and who's poaching from who. But it was really fascinating to see that these other companies are much more focused on, okay, how do I make something with this? How do I use this? And that's both for the LLMs and for agentic use of LLMs, so agents, sort of stuff. I thought there were lots of good examples of that, and it was really interesting to sort of see who, sometimes even in, it seems to me, sometimes even in the same company, you've got, maybe the sort of hype people, and then you've got maybe more, like if we're looking at Google, you've got, Will Granis, who clearly is heavily, he's the CTO of Google Cloud, heavily rooted in helping, some of these companies achieve new things that perhaps they didn't even know were possible with LLMs.
Will Granis was of Google was talking with Highmark Health, a customer of theirs that had been doing some really interesting things with AI. Did you have any takeaways on that specifically?
So yeah, my biggest takeaway from that was just literally there were a few things. One, that he made some really good points about how companies really need to realize that this is not an overnight thing, that they need to have the data, they need to have the systems built. Sometimes that's going to take, a couple of years for some of those things. I and But once they've got those things, suddenly they can deploy them, in many different ways than they expected. So, I thought it was really interesting that Highmark Health was uh, using a lot of these LLMs to basically do multilingual stuff so that they could contact their customers who don't speak English. Now that's such a simple thing, but it's such a huge thing as well, right? That if you're if you're the one provider who can speak all different languages and your competitors can only speak English, even in countries like America, you're going to get a lot of extra customers from that.
Right. Yeah, that was Richard Clark, SVP, Chief Data Officer. The other thing I noticed, you talked about Will Grance's point about just taking time getting the data set up. The companies that really started this early, they're really coming into their own, right? I'm thinking about the Intuits, Capital One, LinkedIn, and I think these provided really good cases for the rest of the audience to see what you could do. But it's really interesting how Capital One or Intuit, they're basically setting these agents that are essentially reflecting real functions, right? That maybe individuals were doing before, but they're real, discrete functions, or maybe part of what, the mundane things of what people were doing. So, for example, Capital One has an agent for evaluating risk, as another agent for auditing, another agent that basically evaluates each one of those agents. And it keeps going and basically constructing agentic system that reflects the org, right? Again, a point underscoring they're doing real work, really focused on solutions. So you have this team of agents. They talked about helping, this is Capital One, right? Helping their car dealership clients, setting up agents, right? So that they could then help their customers find the right car or car loans, right? Intuit doing the same thing with invoice generation, right? With an invoice generation agent, right? Working with a reminder agent, right? In QuickBooks, right? There's their solution for accountants, right? Where business and they said, they've tracked now the results, and businesses are getting paid 5 days faster, right? From these clients on average, right? 10% more likely to be paid fully on time. So yeah.
Both like those companies that you mentioned there were very early adopters of machine learning and using these kind of data tools going back sort of 6 8 years ago, even for some of them. um that was fascinating to sort of see, and I do think you're right that those people have got to kind of lead on doing some of these things. It's also really interesting to sort of see some of the companies like, I think you had one panel with Expedia and Kayak, the CTOs from both those companies, talking about, the challenges that they were facing in sort of competing against, there was a really interesting comment about, if someone's searching for for a hotel in ChatGPT, they can say, "Hey, I want one with an infinity pool," but searching on their platforms at the moment, they can't do that. And so how they're having to sort of, pivot or quickly adapt to like, okay, how do we sort of incorporate new kinds of search, new kinds of discovery for their clients, and that how they have to be able to do that at scale. That was another fascinating thing, I guess, going back to Dylan's talk, was just that how while it's quite easy for you to basically sign up for an account at OpenAI and get a small number of tokens, if you need like millions or even billions of tokens for your particular org, your CTO is on the call, or your vice presidents are on the call to OpenAI begging for tokens. That sounded really troubling. That a lot of these companies are trying to sort of work out, okay, where do we get so many tokens? And I think that going back, this even ties into the model gateway from IBM. Again, this is where companies are starting to realize, well, maybe we don't need the best models for everything. We can get extra tokens by running open weights models ourselves and doing this kind of thing.
Sam, last point on this big point of companies just really focused on real solutions. Stanford, right? Great example. Again, we had on stage the CTO of their hospital, Michael Pfeffer, who talked about how they didn't need a chief AI officer, and this actually became kind of a sub conversation at the event, right? Like, thank goodness you don't have. I think it was Ali Miller, right, who talked about you don't need a chief AI officer anymore. But it's like having a chief mobile officer during the mobile revolution, right? It's like it should basically infuse everything. So basically, Stanford realized, hey, we're getting our practitioners together, right? You got the technologists, the engineers, the domain experts, and they came together and created essentially what appears to be the first EHR, right? Electronic health record that can talk with an LM. And an LM you can ask questions of it. Very simple, but it's just surprising how difficult it had been for hospital systems to actually create something that was HIPAA compliant. And they did this. It was actually proposed, a while back by a student, right, in a practice area. And that just shows the accessibility, of what this we'll get back to the builder point, but I thought it was interesting again, that there's this eschewing of kind of the formality of the kind of this ivory tower of an AI AGI team, right? It's just getting down to work. So Sam, let's move to the fourth and kind of final takeaway, which I think is a big one, right? Which is the team in the age of AI agents. We've touched on this a little bit, right? Varun Mohan, the CEO of Windsurf, as you said, kicked off the event with, I think, a really interesting point that resonated. He's looking at teams of like 3 to 4 squads of 3 to 4 people of engineers, each focused and able to move really quickly. Because if you have a team that's bigger than that, you just really slow down. This has become a conversation in Silicon Valley, right? This is the way Elon Musk works, right? Small teams. And so then the question was, well, you're hiring like crazy. How does that how does that match? And he said, well, basically, yeah, you're basically at these teams of 3 to 4 that are basically working on discrete projects, and you got to kind of manage them, bring them all together. But it's basically that basic unit. He said everyone's a builder, to your point, right? Any other takeaways from you on the team point and
So so yeah, like I do think everyone's a builder now. That it was clear, that we kind of talked about that before. Another takeaway I've seen actually this week from a big company here as well, talking to them, is not only is everyone a builder, everyone's a manager now because they're managing agents, right? And I heard a very interesting thing this week of where one guy who managed an engineering team was saying that, like, all his coders, all the engineers on his team were really frustrated with their agents for the same things that he was frustrated with them, right? So, he was sort of saying, well, you need to articulate what you want better. You need to, like all these sorts of things that I guess managers, sort of pick up over time. People are now starting to realize, oh, if I want to be good at managing multiple agents here and getting them to do things where it's not just a repetition kind of loop, then I need to get good at these skills. So yeah, definitely the whole idea of small teams is something that you're just seeing, more and more and more. Like I, I think you're talking to some people that undergrads that are just starting to graduate, or looking for internships and stuff like that, are finding it really hard because people are just not hiring as much for those low level jobs at the moment. Let's see where that goes, but that's certainly an interesting thing. And it's basically because a lot of these people don't need lots of people now. They can just use this, have small teams. The small team can achieve what a lot of other people could do. And the cool thing with the small teams is you get a much better sort of clarity of outcome. Where if you've only got a few humans and they're instructing agents, then ideally everyone should be on track, probably a lot better than, say, a team of 20 people where some people are going left, right, up, down kind of thing.
right. I think they're, it's GitHub and Atlassian. We're talking about teaching engineers to become managers of agents, right? So that was the conversation throughout. You had a workshop, Sam. I mean, you moderated a couple conversations. You actually had a workshop how to build agents. Any takeaways there? It sounded like some of your audiences were getting into the nitty gritty of
Well,
how to.
yeah, that was really fascinating. Like, the I probably about 10% of the people there were engineers. The rest weren't. A lot of people in sort of senior management, which kind of surprised me that some of these people from senior management wanted to come to a workshop about building agents and had very specific sort of questions like that related to their org, and had really clear sort of ideas of, hey, we want to do this, is this possible, or we've started doing, we're going this down this road, what should we expect? Yeah, that was really interesting to sort of see, like, okay, who was there. Also very interesting later on to see just who added me on LinkedIn that was there, that were from big companies that you would think maybe do know how to do agents, but like some of their questions were showing that, like, okay, they're also still trying to work it out. So I don't think it's, one of the key takeaways I think is that it's not like, everyone's worked this out now. If your company hasn't gotten into this yet, you should be jumping in. You should be trying to do these, at least experiment, get some projects going, try it out, get your staff learning how to do this kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. So two other points I wanted to make sure we fit in here. It's like Andrew Ng, right? One of the big names in AI spoke, and one of the big points that kind of again reverberated as a result of his comments on the first day that we came back on was this idea of leaving safety, governance, observability to the end. Right. There's this big question mark from folks like you mentioned. HD Huang, right, the CTO of Zoom, you mentioned he was there at the event talking about how can we move faster. He wants to really get his agents into place. And Andrew basically providing the response. It's like, you just got to leave, you just got to really sandbox. That kept coming up. Have a sandbox. This is the kind of the best practice, and build within that, and make sure you get a solution that works, because all that safety, governance, observability, and things will slow you down, and nothing gets done. That receives some criticism. I mean, criticism from some folks, because some folks from bigger companies, saying, well, that may not be realistic if everything you do has to be laced, right, with some of these things. But I thought that was an interesting conversation in terms of just the way these teams and organizations are changing. I think the other point was, we saw this in our survey. It was another question, the AI survey that we do annually, that 10% of organizations have no dedicated AI safety team, right? And this is sometimes even in cases where they've deployed agents, even externally, to customers. So I thought that there was also a lack of consensus around how to measure ROI. But it's also true that this can depend on the industry or a specific company case. So that maybe not too surprising. So that's basically the four takeaways. Sam, any big kind of parting notes that we haven't maybe touched on, or wrap ups in terms of what you took away?
I look on the whole, I thought it was fascinating to just sort of see, okay, how far along some of these companies are. So it really is a competitive edge to be able to do this kind of thing. And I felt very vindicated that I've been saying this for quite a long time. And but when you talk to your CTOs of some of these really big orgs, and they're like, "Oh yeah, this is definitely a competitive edge. We have to move fast," like you just mentioned, CTO of Zoom, and a number of the other ones. But it really is sort of the people who get it are moving quickly. And I wonder for the people, the orgs that weren't there, are they going to be the blockbusters of, 3 years from now when we look back? They're the ones that we're going, gee, they were such a big company. Why didn't they sort of get on the AI train and realize that this was going to be something that they needed to do? The other thing too, just really fascinating different use cases of agents, stuff that you would never think about as being a sort of developer, talking to people using these things for real world, really wide variety of different things. I think that's something that, as with all technology, it when people sort of work out how to use it, they end up using it totally different than originally planned, or than sort of what the sort of creators of that technology thought. And I think we're definitely seeing that with LLMs. I'm constantly fascinated by meeting with startups here, meeting with people here that you find that they're doing using LLMs for stuff that you just never would have thought of in the past. And I think a lot of those companies are still in, quite a number of them still in stealth for the startups. As they come out, I think we're going to see this explosion is happening. Uh, and for me, VB Transform really confirmed that, like we talked about, not from just the hype side, but from the real world use side.
Yeah.
That's my big takeaway.
Yeah, yeah. So the explosion is happening, and if I would add one last takeaway, it's how it's happening that is amazing as well, right? When Satya Nadella, I can't remember when it was, like 6 months to a year ago, he was talking about the great rewiring of the company, right? This is essentially kind of like an OS change, right? Operating system change. That it was high level, right? When he talked about it at first, okay, you can get it, yeah, makes sense. Um, but at Transform last week, you saw it from essentially 60 companies, right? Talking about every level, right? The rewiring at the infrastructure level, right? Where you're talking about needing new memory and storage solutions connected with your GPUs, and some companies can't get them. Some companies can in terms of GPUs, right? Everything's unique, and then all up to the application layer, to the way the orchestration happens, to management, to team size. Everything's being changed right now. And to your point, and Microsoft gone on it fast. They've moved, and I think they're ahead of the curve. They saw it coming, and I think this is where a lot of other companies need to get with the programs. It'll be really interesting to follow the story. So thanks, Sam, for being there and joining us at the last Transform. Yeah, we'll have I think the next one scheduled. What is it, July 15th next year? But hopefully everyone can make it next year, and we'll see you then.